so much research has excluded older adults. Why? Because they're complicated and they have lots of issues and they take a lot of time, and they're going to make the research difficult and messy, and we don't want to deal with them.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of The Wendy Cooper Show, conversations with remarkable people over 50. I'm your host, Wendy Cooper, and today my guest is Daniel Plotkin. He is a specialist in geriatric psychiatry. His background is quite impressive, so hold on. He attended USC School of Medicine and did his residency in psychiatry, his fellowship in geriatric psychiatry, and received his master's degree in public health, all at UCLA. He is board certified in general and geriatric psychiatry. If that doesn't impress the crap out of you, Dr. Plotkin is a distinguished fellow with the American Psychiatric Association, clinical professor at the David Geffen School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry, and Biobehavioral Sciences at UCLA. We're talking today about the pressing need for specialists in the field of geriatrics. Given the rapid aging of our society, how unprepared we are as a nation, why mental health is so important to health, and what it will take to clean up the mess that's rapidly ensuing and will affect many generations if we don't act now. Dr. Plotkin, welcome to the show.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We have a lot of ground to cover, but first I would love for you to tell the listening audience how you got into geriatric psychiatry to begin with.
What happened is, and I think it illustrates a good point and shows that we are all, including myself, vulnerable to various prejudices and bias against working with older adults. So I was in my training, early in my training, doing internship after medical school. And we have various rotations that we go on during that year to try to learn a lot about medicine, general medical rotations and surgical rotations. And there's a little bit of flexibility. So we had some rotations that were available, and one of them was geriatrics, and it was geriatric psychiatry. And because I knew I'd be going into psychiatry, I had some interest, but I didn't have particular interest in going onto a unit that was involved with older adults called geriatrics, and no one else did either. So we essentially drew straws, and I lost. So I had to go trudging off to the geriatrics unit, and this was at UCLA. And I had very low expectations, and what I found surprised me, and I had a very good experience. I really loved not only the patients, but I loved the staff. This was very early in the evolution of geriatrics as a specialty in the United States. And so the kinds of people who were drawn to geriatrics were people with a lot of energy and a great sense of humor and kind of roll up your sleeves and get the job done. So it wasn't just the patients, it was actually the staff that was very attractive to me. So after that rotation that surprised me, then I started actually asking for more rotations with geriatrics.
My 37-year-old friend recently told me that she was considered a geriatric pregnancy. So I know we often think of geriatrics as for the elderly, pediatrics for children, but I think geriatrics now, let's define geriatrics for everyone.
In medicine, there are all kinds of specialties, and including, for example, pediatrics, because I think people are familiar with pediatrics. And the idea is that children are different. They're not just like miniature adults. There's a lot that's going on there that requires special focus and training. And so that's why there's been pediatrics. So similarly, with the other end of the age spectrum, older adults, there's a lot going on that's different from just regular medicine and that really requires specialty training. And so geriatrics is just like pediatrics, but it's the other end of the age spectrum. And within medicine, people can specialize in geriatric medicine or geriatric psychiatry.
Okay, so the problem is pretty much this. We have a growing population of people that are living longer, going to be older, and we have a growing population of older people. Then we don't have enough doctors already today that specialize in geriatrics, geriatric psychiatry, and that is going to present a problem in the future. Got it. Why is that? And what kind of doctors are all of these old people seeing if they're not seeing geriatric doctors? I mean, it just seems like every person over a certain age would be seeing a geriatrics.
Very few older people who have some kind of problem, whether it's Alzheimer's or depression or anxiety, and of course, it's possible for people to have all of those because they tend to run together. But anyway, very, very few of those people actually get seen by a specialist like a geriatric psychiatrist. Most of those people don't really get seen by anybody. And that's part of the prejudice, I think, that's in our society, unfortunately, that we are all susceptible to, including myself, is that we tend to think whatever's happening with the older person, oh, that just goes with age. And so we tend to write it off or not take it seriously if somebody is having problems with their memory or they're depressed or lonely. We tend to say, well, just that's to be expected and sort of don't worry about it. So that's a big, big issue.
It sounds like it's only getting to be bigger and bigger. And it's quite scary, actually, as I sit here at 65 years old and I think about what's coming down the pike. There's a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. The fastest growing segment of our population is 85 and up. And that's not even including the baby boomers, which is, our generation.
Yeah, I know. Our generation, which is 60 million people right now. And our generation is supposedly living 20 years longer. So our generation better get on their little, wagon and start something that is going to change things to help and convince and get the support we need for more of the specialists that we all will need, all generations will need going forward. I mean, it just seems like it makes so much sense. Why is it so hard to understand, and why is it not happening? Is this just one more thing that we all have to think about and be aware of and change in our society? It sure sounds like it.
Exactly. That's a very good point, that we're already in tough shape, and it's going to go from bad to worse in terms of the number of older adults with all the problems that go with, being an older adult. Almost all older adults have, one or more medical conditions. And we don't have enough providers. We already don't have enough providers. And it's actually so bad that there's now acceptance that we're not going to have enough providers. There's no way, even if we had 100% increase in the number of doctors going into the field, we would not have enough providers. And it's not just doctors, it also includes other providers.
What is driving this need? Is it because there's so many older people and our population is getting older and older, and a lot of people, like you stated, millions and millions and millions of people? Is it because we're living longer? What is the root cause of the fact that, besides the airplane in the background, but I'm just going to go with it, the fact that, it's not like geriatrics is new. It's not like people just started getting old. It's not like it's just all of a sudden was a need for geriatric psychiatry, psychology, general medicine, and all of the surrounding elements of proper treatment and care for people as they get older. I mean, I wonder what changed, what shifted, why is there such a hole? And I understand it's because it's not reimbursable, but let's make it reimbursable. Why wouldn't they do that? Is it just because people get old and it's okay to make them rot like tomatoes? I mean, I'm not finding any real comfort in this conversation. And I think that it's very worrisome, actually, to think about where it's going to be in 10 years and 20 years. I mean, holy moly, something has to click here. You know, something has to click. We have to start finding ways to create a body of professionals that are going to help with the aging population. I have to say that last year when I was going through a lot of health issues, Kaiser did give me a social worker. And a social worker, I think because I was 64 and I was diagnosed with a recurrence of cancer and they were worried about me becoming depressed. And also I just needed to know where resources were. So for the first time in my life, I had what I called a social worker. And I thought that that was interesting, but it was only because I was diagnosed.
This is a good one that you had an interaction with, I think, a geriatric care manager. Usually it's someone with a master's level background, and oftentimes a social worker who has all these resources at his or her fingertips and can bring them together, and is often also capable of providing some very helpful supportive therapy to help you get through. Being a caregiver for an older adult is highly stressful. There's a whole literature on what's called caregiver burden.
Yeah, I interviewed someone once, Juliet Watt. She did a TED Talk on compassion fatigue. And so I did learn a lot about that. And that is basically caregiver burnout to a certain extent.
Exactly. Compassion fatigue, caregiver burnout. These are different names for the same phenomenon, which is well recognized. And it happens, of course, in situations that don't involve an older adult. But it's so common with older adults. It's such a big part of things that actually part of the training in geriatrics is to recognize what's going on, not just with the patient before us, but with their support system, their family, and to work with their family. And so much of what we do in geriatrics is what we call cognitive services, meaning we think, we talk, we listen, we communicate, we try to collaborate with other providers, whether it's other doctors or psychologists or a physical therapist. It all takes a lot of time. It's very labor intensive. And unfortunately, our reimbursement system is not well aligned with that. Our reimbursement system is, the incentives are to do more technical procedures, like surgical procedures, or procedures like various kinds of scans, whether it's a brain scan or other kind of scan, or procedures like if someone has heartburn, for example. I have a colleague who's a specialist in stomach issues, gastroenterology, and he would love to be able to talk with his patients if they're having indigestion, heartburn, reflux, those sorts of things, and find out about their lifestyle and counsel them and kind of help them through, which takes a lot of time. And he really can't make a living doing that. So what he does is, because the patients want it and it's what he's trained to do, he does endoscopy, which is putting scope, through the mouth and down into the esophagus and the stomach, so he can see what's going on. And that pays quite well, and he's able to, maintain a good living.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes, and I'm only speaking from my own experience, that surgeons like to do surgery. That's why they're a surgeon, so they like to do surgery. Surgeons need to do surgery, but they need that based on CAT scans and PET scans, especially in cancer or whatever, MRIs. So they have to order these very expensive and overbilled, procedures. And then, they want you kind of to wait. And the more you wait, the more your cancer grows, basically. And then one thing leads to another. But what I'm trying to say is that last year I started to record my visits on my voice memo so that, number one, I would remember what they said. Number two, I had something to reference when I wasn't feeling very good. And number three, I had it for my husband to hear. But number four, to protect me, because I was there alone and I might forget something. But at the same time, I found the doctors just kind of shoving me out the door.
It's very good you did that. And that I think, sadly, listening to it, it's very common what you described. And then where you don't get much of a response, then you naturally fill it in by saying, I know there's nothing to be done, which is actually not true. But it's a natural thing to occur to you and to say, to kind of fill in the space. And the doctors, some of them are not the most caring, but most doctors are very caring, but they're really under the gun.
Yeah.
And they're trying to do, cover a lot of territory in 5 to 7 minutes, which is kind of absurd. And you can imagine, again, with you're healthy, but you have this condition it's complex. But imagine if you're 85 or 90 and you have 10 different conditions and you're on 10 different medications. It's really a shame. And the system doesn't give doctors much satisfaction. There's actually a crisis in medicine going on right now where the doctor burnout is so bad that many doctors are turning away patients. They don't want to do clinical care, or they're retiring early. And then the doctors coming out of training, very young doctors who are coming out of training, they usually have huge debt. And it's usually a time in their life where maybe they're having a family, starting a family. So there's no way they're going to go into a field that requires so much time. This is part of the reason why not only doctors, but all kinds of professionals don't go into geriatrics, because you can't really make a living very easily. And a lot of doctors who do go into geriatrics these days, of those few who do, they go into research. They don't go into patient care, because it's too difficult for most people to try to provide all that good care, and when the reimbursement is not there.
Okay, so geriatrics takes patience, takes time, takes a specialty, takes years. And to put the icing on the cake, it's a specialty that isn't reimbursed by insurance. So you are basically kind of like a concierge doctor, I'm assuming. And, you're privately paid by people. And that doesn't seem like an equitable situation for people who there's millions of people that need the services of geriatric psychiatry, psychology, geriatric specialties. So we have to step back and say, there's a big problem, and it doesn't look like that's going to get solved, because there's no real incentive for doctors going into the field of geriatrics. There's no incentive there. If they can't make money, then they're just kind of like, Doctors Without Borders, right? They're going out and they're saving lives because it's their passion. But you still have to pay off your school loan. Sorry, but you do, because you went through all the specialties. All right, so let's back up. What is the solution? What are they working on? There has to be some type of something being done about this. There just has to be.
Right. Well, it's a very good question. And here's some of the remedies. First of all, since we've now accepted that there's no way there's going to be enough physicians, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So this is why you see so many nurse practitioners or physician assistants.
Right.
And that's great. And those are people who, frankly, they don't cost as much as doctors do, and they can provide very good care. So that's one way. Another way is to actually train people, additional people, who might even be lay people. And this is probably the way, the future. And it's even happening in other parts of the world. It's interesting because the United States usually is the leader in healthcare innovation. But in this case, we're not leading, we're sort of trailing. So, for example, in parts of the world like India and even in Africa, where they have much fewer resources and much fewer providers, they're ahead of us in terms of training lay people to provide some basic outreach and basic supportive care, and then be able to refer in an informed way to a professional. So they've done demonstration projects in Ghana that have proven beneficial. And the United States is somewhat behind. We have at least one demonstration project that I know of, which is in Indiana, and an academic medical center where they are training lay people to work.
That seems like a good start to a solution for the ensuing problem. You know, technical and trade schools are always great places of opportunity for people who are very caring. Culturally, they're very caring, yet maybe they don't have the same opportunities as other people, or maybe they just didn't care too much about school when they were younger, and then they find themselves in a place where, you know, they would be well suited for that.
Right, without anything close to a medical background,
Yeah.
and you know, maybe not even having a college.
Right, right.
And it's interesting. I was looking at some of the work from this Indiana project, and they're trying to set it up so that they could select the right applicants. Apparently, the way they do the interviews, they set up stations where they have an opportunity to observe how the applicant would react. So, for example, one of their stations is an older adult who has dementia and is paranoid and is very agitated and is standing behind a door screaming and very fearful, and they want to see how does this applicant react to that situation. And then I think they have half a dozen or so different situations, and then they make their selection about the applicants, and then they go on and train those people who they think have a good degree of compassion and caring, at least the potential.
I think the role playing is so important because I know that I had a lot of fear when my father asked me if I would spend the weekends at his house. I was like, oh, inside, you know, my trigger went off. Like, if something happens, I won't be able to pick him up. He's much too heavy, or I'm not capable of it emotionally. I'm good for 2 hours with my dad, but other than that, I don't feel as though I'm really qualified to know really what to do if something happens. All of these thoughts were like racing through my head that probably don't just belong to me, but belong to probably everyone. I suppose I would feel more comfortable if the family had a plan. Like, you know, I don't know what to do for my dad. I don't even know when he takes his medicine. I don't know any of that. All I know is that he shouldn't have so much sugar, and he likes to just talk to me about his art. But for me to feel comfortable taking care of him, I think there needs to be some type of overall overarching plan. And I really don't know if that exists. And if it does, nobody has shared it with me. So do you have any kind of advice on families, you know, getting it together, especially big families, because the responsibility shouldn't just be on one person or two people. And then again, there's small families or no families at all. So, wow, you start to think about all this stuff. It gets scary.
That's right. We often we try to make the distinction between the quantity and the quality. So just not just the number of years, but the quality of life of those years. And so people who do not have cognitive impairment, like your father, only has maybe some mild, if anything. I think one point I want to make is that that's most older people, contrary to what maybe popular belief is. Most older people, they still have their marbles. And we tend to be scared and focus on the people who develop dementia, but most people do not. So that's just worth emphasizing.
That's
And so
interesting.
people who are generally with it, like your father, they often do planning. And again, if he was being seen by a geriatric medicine or geriatric psychiatry type of doctor or system, that is part of what's usually on the agenda to help patients with this planning and to think about these things, as most people have done. Most people have thought about it, but not in an organized way. And some people need help to be able to really think through what if they're no longer able to make decisions? Who do they want to make decisions for them? And there's ways to designate that. If you can have one person make decisions that are healthcare decisions, and a different person can make financial. These things can be discussed and often are in a geriatrics type setting, but in a non-geriatric setting, they rarely are.
I have a neighbor and he has dementia. Now, he can have he's about 70, I think, and it's early onset dementia, I suppose. But anyway, he comes over, he drinks his Janet down the street makes him a cup of coffee, and he comes in front of my house and has a normal conversation with me. You would never think the guy had dementia whatsoever. And then I talked to his wife, and she only complains about he forgets to close the freezer, or he doesn't flush the toilet, or he doesn't know how to. It's like he's a little kid, So I don't see that. I just see my neighbor who is perfectly fine, actually, to have a great conversation with. And he complains about her all the time. So, but I do know as a fact that he can't drive anymore. He's only allowed to walk certain areas, so he doesn't get lost on his way home. But you would never know there was anything wrong with this guy if you didn't know that he had dementia.
Dementia is a very broad term. So it includes Alzheimer's disease. There are different diseases that can cause dementia. It's considered a medical condition. It doesn't just go with aging. Forgetfulness is part of it, having memory difficulties, and there can be difficulties in other realms like language and speech. But what's also very much a part of it is it affects function. That's actually the key part, is that people have problem functioning in their day-to-day life. These things we look at that are called activities of daily living, and we have another category called instrumental activities of daily living. And the basic activities are like being able to dress yourself and feed yourself and go to the bathroom and bathe and that sort of thing. And the instrumental activities are a little higher level that might include writing checks or being able to use a cell phone. And then there's also things like driving that are very important. So it's how someone functions that's really the key. So if an older adult is having memory problems, but is still able to function quite well, then he or she does not have dementia.
Can we talk a little bit about depression in, geriatric depression, I suppose you might call it? I know that it's in younger people. I know that in most people, it can go misdiagnosed or undiagnosed for many years. And then there's also, anxiety. So what are your thoughts on depression in general?
Generally in younger adults, it tends to involve, feelings that are clearly there of sadness or not being able to experience pleasure, and again, it affects functioning. In older adults, it can be really difficult to diagnose and to tease out, because in older adults, they might manifest depression not so much as sadness, but as irritability. And yet we find if older people who are irritable in ways that they have not been previously, if they're treated for depression, then it changes and they get over that irritability. So it's something that's all too easy to just write off as, oh, that's just grumpy grandpa, and that's the way older people get. But it's not necessarily. And these are all the different conditions that need to be probed and checked out, and can only be done in the good old-fashioned way of sitting down and talking with someone. Of course, best in person, but even over Zoom is fine. Either way, it takes a lot of time to really probe these things.
Wow, it just, the more I listen to all of this, the more I'm sitting here thinking, people just have to know about this. You have to really, really start to think about geriatric medicine in general. That's frightening.
Just getting the word out. And I think part of what we have to remember is it's not just getting the word out to the lay public, although that's crucial. It's also getting the word out to the professional side, because most providers are just not aware themselves. That sometimes even when they are aware, they just don't have the time to deal with it. So just an example, I'll tell you of someone, a typical older adult who, let's say, has high blood pressure and diabetes and has become depressed. The great majority of those people don't receive any kind of treatment for the depression, even though they may receive treatment, usually medication, for the blood pressure and the diabetes.
Yeah, that's my dad, diabetic, and he has heart.
Of course, and so if he was to become depressed, the chances are he would not get any kind of diagnosis or treatment for that. And then of those few people who do get diagnosed with depression, the great majority are treated by the primary care doctor. They're not seeing a psychiatrist or a geriatric psychiatrist or a psychologist. They're treated by the primary care doctor. And that's usually, it takes two to tango. That's usually a dance that has to do with the patient and the doctor not wanting to really take the time to look at alternatives. It's the easiest thing, especially in our culture with such a dominant psychopharmacology perspective, is that most older adults with some degree of depression are treated by their primary care doctors with an antidepressant medication. And while antidepressant medications are, they're good in general, but they're not magic, and they need to be, properly managed. And really that requires a lot of time, and it's best done by a specialist.
You once told me about the classifications of the different ages of geriatrics. So there's the young old, the middle old, and the old, I think. Why is that important? I think it's a little obvious, but am I right?
So in general, the 65 to 75 or 65 to 74 is what we call the young old. And then 75 to 84 is the middle old. And 85 and up, which is the fastest growing segment, that's called the old. And they often have multiple problems. So it's not a matter of do they have a problem or not. Of course, if you're in your upper 80s or 90s, you're going to have multiple medical conditions that are existing simultaneously, and it's not an either or, and it's a lot to deal with, to try to help people with, and that's where usually a system of care is needed. And that's, again, gets back to this is very time intensive, labor intensive, and often it's helpful to have a team approach. In geriatrics, that's a very well-known approach, is to have a team where you have a general medical person, and you have someone who's doing care management, and you might have a psychiatrist involved, and you might have a physical therapist or a personal trainer involved. You might have speech therapists involved. So it's usually a team and it requires coordination.
It's so complicated, yet it makes so much sense that knowing the patient's history is so important. My friend ended up having a genetic mutation. She was like 67, and they shouldn't have given her any type of benzodiazepine, but she would show up at the emergency room because she had nobody else and she didn't feel right. And so on the third go around, they just kept giving her, oh, well, take Xanax or take Klonopin or take this just to get rid of her. Seriously, just to get rid of her. And she ended up being, for 3 years, she has tried to get herself back to normal. It's just obscene. For me, it's just obscene.
Fortunately, is very common. And there's even something called the doorknob phenomenon, which happens in medicine, is that the busy primary care doctor or nurse practitioner is ending the 5 or 7 minute visit, and the patient says, just as the doctor puts his or her hand on the doorknob to leave the examining room, hey doc, I can't sleep. And of course, that sleep problem, that may be part of depression. That's commonly part of depression, but there's all kinds of reasons to have a sleep problem. But the doctor, he or she, doesn't have time to deal with it. So what they do is they write out a prescription for a sleeping pill, a sedative hypnotic is what we call it. And oftentimes that's a benzodiazepine, which is a Valium type drug. The other drugs that are common and are just like the benzodiazepines, but technically they're chemically different. Those are ones like Ambien. Ambien is very common. So they're similar. So anyway, these part of the good thing with these medications, they're very effective. And part of the downside with these medications is
they're very addictive.
They're effective and people get hooked on them and they build up tolerance.
Yeah.
So what generally happens with this scenario that I'm painting is that the older person who can't sleep, they're given a prescription and it helps them. And so instead of the doctor taking the time, because it takes a lot of time to counsel the person about the proper use of the medication, which is very short term.
Yes.
It needs to be done very short term or very occasionally. But what happens is the person builds up tolerance and they need more and more, and they're taking it every night. And then they call when they run out, and the front desk handles it and says, to the doctor, can I refill, this medication, the sleeping pill for, Joe Smith, and it gets refilled. And then what happens, unfortunately, we know that these medications are associated with memory impairment and balance impairment. And so they're associated with falling and fracturing a hip. So sometimes it's like 5 years later, the person has fallen and fractured their hip. And this is, a big turning point in their life. And oftentimes no one just connects the dots and they don't realize that it was that medication that had a lot to do with them falling and fracturing their hips. So this is where there's a connection between mental and physical things all over the place.
I find the few people that I know that have passed away and I have been around as they are passing, that they like to reminisce about their life. And I think that that's an indicator when people know that their time is coming soon. They really start to talk more about their life. Last time I saw my father, I tried to encourage him, that I understood that, he feels as though, he's going to die and that he wants to make sure that he has some type of legacy in place. I like to buy him a microphone. I wanted him to talk into the microphone and just tell stories about his art so that we had that documented. And I said, and while you're at it, Dad, you can tell stories about me and my brothers and Mom and, things that maybe you just don't share with us on a regular basis, nor have you ever. But I felt something different in my dad last time I saw him. And I think it's a good thing to talk to someone about dying, all my family likes to avoid it like the plague, but I've been faced with my own mortality, and I think I have an easier time at it. And I think it's kind of an interesting way to give someone who is older the ability to think about their lives and feel as though they had a purpose, and to remind them that they did accomplish great things. They did raise a family. They did make that trek from New York to California with 6 kids. There were things in their life that were very, very important, although you might not feel that right now. I don't know. What do you think?
Sometimes difficult topics, and it's usually it's a welcome experience to the older adult who's thought about these things, but people oftentimes are just tiptoeing around and nobody's talking about it. And there's even a type of approach that's called life review or reminiscence therapy. And this was first described by the doctor who really started geriatrics in our country. His name was Robert Butler, and he died some years ago. But he was actually a psychiatrist, and he was the founding director of the National Institute of Aging in our country, and started the first department of geriatrics in New York. So, when I say geriatrics, I don't mean just psychiatry, all of geriatrics, medicine and psychiatry. Anyway, he's the one he coined the term ageism. That was his term that he coined in the 60s, and he wrote a book in the 70s that was called Why Survive? Being Old in America.
Yeah.
And it actually won the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction, but very few people have read it. Anyway, one of the other things he described was he observed older people talking about the past and reminiscing.
Yes.
And instead of just thinking, oh, isn't that cute, and patting them on the head, he thought, no, this is something serious and maybe important. So he studied it. And what he determined is that it's seemingly a universal, natural, psychological developmental stage in older adults to think back on life. And it gets back to this term legacy that you were bringing up, to think about the meaning and the purpose of one's life.
Yeah.
And think about having like a coherent sense of what you've been doing in your life. And this has also been described by Erik Erikson and other psychologists who have looked at the idea that psychological development continues past adolescence into adulthood and even into old age. And so Robert Butler coined this approach to actually talking with older people about their lives, life review. And it's also sometimes called reminiscence therapy. And sometimes it's done in groups and sometimes it's done individually. Say, look, it's normal and good to be thinking back on your life and putting it together and having a sense of legacy. That's normal and it's healthy. And it's even good to memorialize it in some way, whether it's audio or audio plus video or a book or whatever it is. I often tell to my patients who are thinking about this and are somewhat reluctant, and I say, look, think about your great-great-grandkids, 100 years from now, that how great it would be for them to be able to view this or look at this book and have a sense of what your life was like and what their great-great, grandmother or grandfather was like.
Well, I certainly hope that, AARP or whomever the lobbyists are in Washington, D.C. about aging and taking care of people that are getting old, because there's a lot of us, is happening. But, you're right. We just need to build awareness everywhere, because God willing, everyone ages, but being old is just another thing. So
I think addressing your good points, we need to change the institutions, and this is going to take generations. So even in in modern medicine, for example, it's kind of shocking, but older adults have been systematically excluded from clinical research until just recently. So all these clinical research studies that are done in medicine were systematically excluding older adults. So at least we're seeing some changes, but that's an indication of where we're at as a society, and maybe we're starting to get to a point where there's going to be some progress, because as of a couple of years ago, researchers who are getting federal funding to help them with their research, they need to make sure that older adults are included. Otherwise, it's actually been kind of a joke in geriatrics that we have been evidence-free, which, of course, not a good thing. Right. But because everybody wants evidence-based medicine, but right. We kind of feel like we've been evidence-free because so much research has excluded older adults. Why? Because they're complicated and they have lots of issues and they take a lot of time, and they're going to make the research difficult and messy, and we don't want to deal with them. And that's kind of the same attitude that society has in general. And I think we need to really get the word out and build all the grassroots agencies. And there are agencies that, of course, aside from AARP, but they don't have the kind of voice they should have. I think maybe, our generation, the baby boomers, will be able to turn things around, because otherwise there's been warnings for decades about exactly what's going to happen, and no one heeds the warning.
Well, on that note, we need to wrap up the show, and I want to thank you for taking the time for being here today, and I look forward to helping you get the word out and bringing some awareness to this major problem. I thank you so much for that work that you're doing in the field, and I really look forward to it.
Thanks, Wendy.
It sounds a little bit like climate change. It slowly creeps up on us, and the years go by and everyone turns their heads until it's too late. They see that reflection in the mirror. And it's just absurd the way we deal with issues that seemingly don't affect us and then complain when they do. I want to thank everyone for listening today, and I especially want to thank Daniel Plotkin for his dedication and his work in this field. If you would like to find out more about Dr. Plotkin, you can go to my website, send me an email, and I will send you the information on how to get in touch. So stay tuned for more episodes where we dive a little bit deeper into some questions. Hey, even if you have a question or whatever it is that you want us to talk about, then please let Dr. Plotkin and myself know by going to my website, wendycooper.com. I just want to thank you for listening. I would love to wish you well. Stay healthy, stay happy, stay safe, and keep listening. I'll see you next time. The show was produced by C-Spot Run Productions. Theme music by Tom Orsi of Orsi Digital Post. This episode was edited down from its original content.